Hello, everyone. A good day to you. My name is Sophia. We sincerely thank you for taking time out from your busy schedule today in joining us for this recorded webinar. Instasafe, as you may already know, started out with a mission to make the digital world we live in more secure. Our collective goal is to make the internet safe, connected, and open. This webinar is a step towards making organizations ready for the precarious conditions that we are faced with in the current context. Today, in this webinar, we are going to cover remote access best practices that organizations should follow in the pandemic and post pandemic business climate. In the next 45 minutes, our speakers are going to take you through how the coronavirus outbreak has changed workforce dynamics, what are the primary challenges being faced by security teams in dealing with remote workforces, and what steps can be taken by security teams to deal with these challenges. Joining us in our discussion will be Pratik Samantarai. Pratik is a part of the marketing strategy team of Instasafe. He had prior experience of managing his own startup besides working for Robert Bosch. Pratik has a deep insight in market trends and consumer behavior of the cybersecurity domain and hopes to utilize the same to design solutions that cater to near-term security needs of modern enterprises. Shrikant NV. Shrikant comes with a 20 plus years of experience working with companies like Web Inflow, where he has been part of numerous checkpoint firewalls and websins, now known as Forcepoint, SIEM implementations, deployments, and customer engagements, including trainings. Since this is a recorded webinar, we'll try to cover all the frequently asked questions that might have come up in the course of the presentation. So, now without much further ado, I'll be handing over proceedings to Pratik. Over to you, Pratik.
Thank you for the introduction, Sophia. Good day to all the participants. I'm Pratik, and I will be starting off by setting the context and the agenda for today's session. So, as Sophia mentioned, our discussion today will be revolving primarily around what the remote access best practices that organizations should follow in the context of today's ensuing business conditions, and how businesses should prepare for such eventualities in the future. So we will be touching upon the unprecedented changes that have been brought about in the realm of cybersecurity in this short period of time, and then we'll be following up with a conversation on how your organization can work towards sound remote work policy for similar eventualities in the future. And finally, we'll be explaining to you how InstaSafe can be an instrumental part of your security setup and make your digital transformation journey much easier. So I do have Shrikant with me who will be garnering some valuable insights on how information security teams can handle the security of their organizations in these troubled times. So, yeah. Now that I've set the agenda for today's session, we will be moving on with the webinar. So the effects of the pandemic outbreak on the organizations have been unprecedented, but our focus will lie mostly on the cybersecurity aspect of it. This has been described by Bloomberg as the largest work from home experiment in the world. And we are in a situation wherein organizations have been forced to function with a large distributed workforce. So I do have some stats here, which are shocking to say the least. Now, one of the most prominent stats here is that 77% of workforce is expected to work from home, and this percentage is actually expected to increase in the next few days or the next few months. So we are in a situation where organizations again have been forced to function with such a large distributed workforce and with inadequate security setups to back up access to the remote employees. Now, given these astounding stats with regard to remote workforces, this entire scenario has created an environment where malicious actors of all kinds can thrive. So we have been seeing instances of coronavirus related phishing attacks since January. To cite some examples, we have seen threats like a master boot record wiper called coronavirus, which overwrites Windows system users' computers and renders them useless in the process. Now we've also had instances of malicious Android apps which spy on users who install them on their device. So in essence, we are faced with a situation when the information security team of every organization will have to be constantly on their toes to deal with the challenges of a much larger attack surface. So, Shrikant, I would like your viewpoint here on how the state of cybersecurity has underwent massive changes in the last 2 months or so.
Absolutely, Pratik. So, as we all know, there has been a substantial increase of users who are going to work from home due to the present pandemic situation across the world. So, owing to that, since the number of users have increased, in the work from home scenario, the threats have also increased accordingly, and the attack surface has become that much larger. We know that remote users are susceptible, and the remote user devices that they use used by them are also vulnerable. So the attacks can increase and lead to more security incidents, which
Right,
should be avoided with the help of controls which can be better implemented.
right. So moving on, now there are some steps which information security teams can take in the meanwhile to secure critical assets and shield them from malicious attacks through off-premise systems, and in the process try to maintain business continuity for organizations. So the first step that enterprises can take is that they can deploy DLP in audit-only mode. Now, of course, DLP does provide a strong set of capabilities, but again, its utility is limited to protection against unauthorized movement of data. So it's pretty much unidirectional in its security approach. So this means that DLP is intended to protect the data you already have, but it doesn't protect you from the reception of data. So this is where the information security team needs to leverage analytics to protect data from access by the riskiest users, and protection against APTs and identification of data exfiltration efforts can be done through encrypted web sessions via traffic inspection. So, Shrikant, what's your take on this?
Yes, so from the DLP perspective, you definitely require the data loss prevention both at the end user level and at the gateway level to make sure that data loss is overall prevented and
Right,
data exploitation doesn't take place. Now, when it comes to monitoring users who are rated to be risky in the sense that when users are doing a lot of financial transactions, for example, a company's financial department is doing online financial transactions, they may require a higher level of authentication when doing this transaction rather than a normal employee. So you
right,
can use multi-factor authentication to kind of fortify his access and alert if there's any kind of malicious activity that is taking place. And finally, when it comes to business continuity, overall, you should make sure that all the controls are in place and ensure that there's no disruption in service, uh, when including having measures like high availability and load balancing.
right.
Yep.
So all in all, despite these steps, security teams may find themselves facing huge security challenges which act as potential roadblocks in maintaining business continuity for their organizations. But of course, extending access to organizational resources, especially to a remote workforce, it will carry with it obvious security risks. So we'll cover these security challenges that are coming up for organizations. So the primary risk happens when technology is removed from places wherein they can be controlled. And catering to a remote workforce, it will bring with it the inherent risks of having a larger attack surface to protect. And the fact that some of your employees may be using your corporate assets on an unsecured public network, it will bring with it the fear of threat actors intercepting your critical assets and exploiting unprotected networks to launch attacks on your security infrastructure. Now, this is further accentuated by the fact that malicious actors nowadays they just happen to have a lot of free time in their hands, owing to the lockdown and all. And so, I have with me a very interesting stat that reads as follows. So, there has been a 37% increase in attempted breaches since last month. And in addition, there has been a 4,300% increase in coronavirus themed breaches since February. And the threats are not just limited to these outside attacks. So, given the tough road ahead in terms of economic recessions and impending global boom busts, so it is expected that large layoffs will inevitably lead to disgruntled former employees trying to siphon off sensitive data. So all of this necessitates the need for additional layers of security. So what other security challenges come to mind, Shrikant, when we speak about the impending situation in the coming few months?
Yeah, so when we have seen that due to this pandemic situation, the work from home users have risen, and the networks are also have become that much more vulnerable, and
Right,
there's been a lot of cyber attacks that have been taking place. It means there's been an increase in cyber attacks. For example, there was this Maze mm, ransomware attack on a corporate. There were emails attacked and hacked
right,
for a couple of corporates, which is another couple of which have been major incidents in hacking. So if you see, the threat from the insiders also is a large has increased largely. Now
right,
you don't need somebody being like a scientist, behaving like a scientist, sitting in one corner with a beard grown to actually hack into a system. We have online tools, and hacking has become such an easy thing to do nowadays, right?
right,
So one thing is the malicious hacker who does the malicious activities from the inside, and there's an also another threat which is rather inadvertent to the from the point of view that the user doesn't know that he's going to be a threat to the network, because he or she will be doing some activities where they might be sending out data unknowingly, mistakenly outside the network, or downloading malicious mails and causing malware to be downloaded, spyware to be downloaded, etc. So these are some of the challenges that also have to be looked into.
right. Very well put, Shrikant. So in this entire scenario, again, there are certain tips which we as a cybersecurity company would recommend so that information security teams can follow them to ensure that the security setup is left to function unhindered and the number of risks are potentially minimized. So the first step is implement, don't reinvent. So the first tip for you would be to implement existing policies stringently instead of reinventing and trying to readjust your steps from scratch. This may be done by understanding your security workflow, and you can implement dynamic work from home policies which address security challenges that you might be facing while handling distributed workforces. So having a documented work from home policy and training your teams and managers in it becomes very important in this scenario. Of course, the entire success of your policy would depend on the level of sensitization of your employees, as Shrikant had pointed out earlier. So it's always wise to carry out a mock rollout of your communication strategy. Now, this applies not only in terms of security policies, but also for business continuity planning, limiting internal communication to on sensitive topics to classic forums like maybe a Basecamp or a Slack. Uh, it can be good from only, not only an organizational standpoint, but also from a security standpoint. Shrikant, do you have anything to add on this?
Yeah, just a little about the workflow. So the IT team needs to have a thorough understanding of the workflows of the business teams, which
Right,
forms a critical part of the activity, as they can plan then they can chart out a proper security measure according to the workflows and according to the access given to the teams respectively.
right, got it. So coming to our second tip, assess, evaluate, and secure. So it's necessary that you evaluate your remote access capabilities and revamp them if necessary. So most organizations, they've been found to be woefully inadequate when it comes to catering to a remote workforce. And the security setups which they have in terms of traditional security setups, they've mostly been found to be lacking in terms of flexibility, in terms of scalability, and mostly in terms of security as well. So one of the primary tasks at hand would be to categorize and factor in all requirements for on-premise and cloud applications, which are indispensable for the employees. At the same time, you need to do an assessment of any gaps that may arise in your security setup by extending access to critical assets to remote workforces. And if you do have IAM solutions, you need to answer tough questions like how scalable is it to the remote workforce and what possible gaps can be exploited by threat actors. Do you have anything to add on this, Shrikant, as to whether as to whether identification of critical assets need to be addressed in the events of such emergencies?
Absolutely, Pratik. So, we know that the remote access employees will will definitely access applications. So when they are accessing applications, from what devices to the access, what endpoints to the access, you need to do a kind of a security study or an assessment of all the endpoints. Make sure that the endpoints meet the regulatory and or compliance or at least a security standard from which a safe connection can be initiated. And not only from the endpoint, but even from the central network or the corporate or the enterprise, you need to have strict measures to ensure that your network security controls are in place so that you are ensuring safer access, definitely.
Yeah, that's very good point, Shrikant. So coming to the issue of remote access security, again, as you mentioned before, companies need to review if their systems have the capacity to support the entire workforce, and if not, they need to find out if the security solutions which they employ, VPNs as an example, can be scaled in a short period of time to manage the surplus requirements. Now, traditional solutions like VPNs, which are employed by a majority of organizations in their security setup, they usually not feasible enough or viable enough in these security situations when they need to be scaled up in a short period of time and cater to a large remote workforce. So, in these situations, your human resources need to be categorized into critical and non-critical resources for the purpose of granting access based on your limited capability. Now, before all this, your critical applications also need to be tested for capacity as well. Uh, and organizations can then go on to create special private connections for critical employees so as to ensure an unhindered operation for them. This is specifically important for organizations which employ VPNs, since the critical assets need to have an unhindered and seamless user experience, which is not possible in the case of such traditional solutions. So what is your take on this, Shiva?
So the security team or the IT team needs to know the exact number of employees or workers who have the intention of accessing the resources remotely, group
Right,
wise or departmental wise, so that they can properly plan the resources and have a separate, you know, mm, access plan for them based on the type of security that is required for each group. And we also suggest that the security team does a mock connection based on the number of users and for especially for critical applications and test it out before it is implemented real time in production. That would help in saving a lot of time if there's any issue that would be brought up otherwise.
right. So very good point, Shrikant. So moving on to our last step, which is something that Shrikant has stressed on before. There's a dire need to sensitize your employees about the risks associated with accessing business applications on private and secure networks. So the least that can be done is employees can be asked to harden the routers by at least keeping them password protected. Now, since a majority of recent attack attempts have been through phishing sites or even through false infection maps of coronavirus sites or applications doing the rounds on the internet, so it's necessary to make employees aware about such scammers. So Shrikant, what's your viewpoint on this?
Yes, so it's important to sensitize the users, give them
Right,
some kind of a security awareness training, and so that will help them to avoid uh, issues like opening unwanted mails, unsolicited mails, or, replying to unwanted or unsolicited mails, and opening links that are unsolicited, which may go to web sites which are harmful or malicious.
right,
That is a very important thing. And other than that, we know that everybody who's working from home have their own broadband connections and routers. These routers need to be updated with the latest firmware. Please ensure that happens, and also use a software rather softly. Sorry, rather use proper passwords rather than just use a simple password like the word password itself for access to router or to your Wi-Fi connection. Make sure that you
right.
have a good alphanumerical secure connection. I mean, rather a secure password with an alphanumerical combination with a special character also introduced into it, and that makes the connection much secure.
Yeah. So again, given these situations, remote access is the need of the hour, and organizations need a security solution which which is viable and has features like like seamless user experience. So there should not be any issue with the usage of a variety of tools. And companies usually prefer solutions which can operate in a variety of cloud environments. Again, the solution should be deployable in minutes. It should be easily deployable as well as easily scalable and flexible enough to be extended across a large workforce, which is in contrast to traditional solutions like VPNs. And one of the major points to be stressed on here is customer support. Now, deploying solutions that extend to such a large workforce, it requires 24/7 customer support, which is usually not given in the case of traditional solutions. So, Shrikant, would you like to throw some light on the other points as well?
Sure. One of the things is that when we see that there is a uh, huge increase in the cloud space usage nowadays, right? People use the hybrid cloud with resources being both on-premise and cloud, or important and critical servers in the cloud. So you should actually be sure that your solutions are flexible. The security solutions that you deploy, for instance, for accessing the resource and application is flexible enough to handle an authentication to a cloud resource also well, equally well as for an on-premise solution.
Right,
Then, from the compliance perspective, it's important that the security administration department plans the compliance regulatory reports that are needed for an organization as per the regulatory that they follow. Could be a PCI DSS for the payment card, or for a HIPAA compliance for the health industry, where patients' records are to be protected, etc. So security compliance is very important. Some of them could even be following the ISO 27001, and in that case, they need to have all the necessary controls, which could be starting from the anti-malware to the data loss prevention as well. Now, you'd also need proper secure access, which is unhindered to applications, and so you need to have a good amount of planning behind that for high availability and load balancing, where applications are accessed without any latency. And if there's any problem with one single server in being accessed, a secondary server should be there online, and should give a seamless experience to the user in accessing applications, because it's not just about giving the secure access, but also the access which is fruitful to the organization, as
right.
it should be unhindered.
Got it. It's a very good point put forth, Shrikant. So moving on now, all of these points that points to the fact that we are in need of a solution that is both disruptive and viable enough to cater to the needs of the post-pandemic world and the pandemic world. So in this scenario, we would love to throw light on Instasafe solutions. So over to you, Avinash, to help us understand how Instasafe can help organizations in their journey towards digital transformation.
Yeah, thanks, Pratik. So in this diagram, you're seeing on the left side personal devices being used, employees accessing the resources from outside of the network, partners, and telecommuters or road warriors accessing the resources over VPNs, right? So you have VPNs which are secured today with the help of maybe even multi-factor or two-factor authentication. All that is fine, but at the end of the day, what happens is that in an IPsec tunnel or a SSL VPN, which you're going to use with the help of a client, a browser-based or a thin piece of client which sits on the endpoint, it is still vulnerable, because the one reason is the user shares invariably or mostly shares credentials with other users. And so that is not a good thing to do, right? It's not a good practice where users share credentials with others, and that becomes a security loophole. That is one. And secondly, the connections that ensue from start from a laptop or a device, a personal device, uh, if the endpoint isn't properly secured and compliant with all the required updates of the OS, the antivirus, anti-malware, EDR, whatever is present, that becomes hopeless, as there can be an attack taking place like a man in the middle attack or whatever, right? And the session hijacks can take place, and that can lead to unwarranted situations. Now, in the security forefront. So, that being the case, what it means is that today, having just a VPN solution isn't enough, and there should be much more beyond that to validate a connection continuously for authentication, etc.
Right.
Because once the user also lands into the network, he or she maybe would access other resources in the network without proper permissions and privileges being offered to the person who is accessing, right? So it becomes very important that you tighten the rules and make sure that resource is granted only to what he or she wants, and that is another parameter that has to be considered.
Right.
So we see that the network perimeter is vanishing, even though the firewall is present at the perimeter. We think that the access being granted to resources is there to both on-premise and cloud resources, because the servers, the critical application servers, are present both on the cloud and both in the cloud and on-premise, and it becomes a hybrid situation where a customer or a partner or an internal employee may want access to multiple resources across a multi-cloud environment and on-premise as well. So that comes more security challenges, and so hence it's very critical that the user is given extremely tightened kind of and fortified access to the resources with ample authentication provided and ample authorization rules provided. So that is where we are coming from. The approach to our solution is from here, where we are trying to say when the network perimeter vanishes, how do you treat the users? What kind of an approach is required to fortify this access and ensure safe access as well? So the Instasafe approach is about enabling secure remote access. So even before giving the secure access, we make sure that we assess the network. We know the attack surface. The assessment that is done with the help of a vulnerability assessment team. In our case, it's called Safe Hatch, where this team kind of does a complete vulnerability assessment or even a penetration test to know all the vulnerabilities present. You can check the risks and mitigate them before implementing other solutions. And then moving on to the zero trust solution of ours, which I'll give you further insight into what should be done to implement this zero trust and how it works. So the Instasafe zero trust model. What is zero trust according to you? So zero trust means that when a user tries to access a resource, I start with absolutely no privileges to access that resource, zero privileges, and then give a privilege later on after authenticating or authorizing. It means I authenticate, I authorize, and keep verifying for every connection that he or she tries to make while accessing the resource. And when the user accesses the resource, before accessing, when the authorization and authentication has taken place, it doesn't mean that the user gets default access to the resource that he or she wants, be it a server or any other resource like a printer, whatever it is. So there is a separate ACL rule written, and the tool helps in giving that access, granting that access to the user to that resource which he or she is meant to use, and nothing else beyond that. So that means there is no lateral movement possible for any user who is coming into the network or to the in the cloud, accessing the servers or accessing the corporate network. He only sees the resource that he or she is meant to access, and other resources are invisible to that user. That is the beauty of a zero trust, wherein as I said, every uh, connection request is checked, verified. When authentication takes place and authorization takes place, it is always verified every time a user tries to connect. So after verification is granted use the access to the resource. Now, what are the tenets in this? So what are the how do you start with this? So you just need a simple thing called an agent, which sits on the end user's uh, device. So device could be a laptop or a handheld device or a tablet, whatever, on Windows or on iOS or Android, Linux. And this agent helps in establishing the connection to what we call as a controller. Now, the controller of ours, of Instasafe, we place it in the AWS cloud. So
Right.
our controller supports AWS cloud, and it is present in the cloud. The user clicks on the agent and establishes a connection to the controller. From there, it gets the connection is authenticated and authorized to access the resource. So I'll give you more details as we move on to the next slide. But in this slide, you're also seeing devices. So devices are also authenticated. We'll talk about how that happens. And binding users to devices also is important. So users should be bound to devices so that that's an extra level of security where they don't, when they can't use other devices except the ones which they are bound to. That gives a good advantage to the security level being offered, isn't it? So you verify the endpoint hosts are running required software, then you establish the tunnel, make sure that the devices are authenticated, make sure that devices are bound to users, or rather the users are bound to devices which are only used to access, and then give the access to the resource. So you have adaptive control on verifying who is accessing, what is required, contextualize that request, secure the administration environment, and then grant the access to the resource with least privilege. So you're kind of auditing everything, you're kind of verifying every connection, authenticating, authorizing continuously, right? And verifying the connection continuously and substantiating the connection for security, for a secure access. Go on to the next slide. Uh, so here I'll tell you how this whole thing works from the point of device and the security. And what are the other features that we have, right? So I told you that the controller sits in the AWS cloud. So you may wonder, what about other clouds? Okay, so we also support other clouds. We can have the controller in other clouds as well, no problem. It also supports Azure, it supports GCP. Now, just to give you an insight into that, we can have a backup controller in Azure and have the primary controller in uh, AWS. In case AWS completely fails, we can kind of move the entire connection over to the secondary controller in Azure, so that you still have seamless access to your resources. Now, when an employee or a partner or a customer tries to connect with an agent, he's as I said before, he or she is authenticated by the controller. So the controller, after it authenticates, that means there is a tunnel that is formed between the user and the controller. And then after authentication, then the user is granted access to the resource based on the rule or the ACL that is present and written on the controller. So ACL rule is important for the access to be obtained to the required resource. Now, what makes that access possible? So in front of the resource, we have a gateway agent that sits in front of the resource, and that is usually on an operating system like Ubuntu or Linux. And this agent is responsible for creating a connection, a tunnel back to the controller. And all you need is an outbound port open on the firewall for an outbound connection to establish that connection, a tunnel to the controller. So that completes the end-to-end connection and makes the connection secure and gives you access to only that resource for the connection, right? That's the important point which I'm stressing about, because that's what zero trust access is all about. After you verify, you only give access to the uh, resource that is he or she is meant to use, and everything else, all the other resources remain invisible to the user, and so that there's no the attack surface is completely minimized here, and it's completely invisible to the user. Now, uh, the other point which I want to talk about now is about the device. So when a device is used to connect, right? So on the left, you can see a device like a iPad or a what you call a tablet or a phone, etc. Right? And this device, how do you know that this device is, fit for a connection? What I mean is, you have something called a device check. We have something called device check, which we do to ensure that this device is okay for a connection to the mm, controller and thereon to the resource. So in the device check, we check if the, earlier there used to be MAC binding. We do MAC binding, we do check on device OS, we do device serial number check, device UUID. UUID also is checked. And this kind of avoids, when the device is checked and bound, okay, in device binding, this kind of eliminates uh, credential sharing. So this is actually device binding, where by the device serial number or by the device OS or the UID, you can bind a user to a particular device, and this completely avoids sharing of credentials, right? For another unauthorized user or a device to log in, it's completely prevented. That's not possible at all, and it also prevents MITM or man in the middle attacks that way. So there's another thing which is checked, which is from where is the user logging in? Is it the right domain? And this is called a device check. And is it the right domain from which he's supposed to access? And is that that system has, or that device has got the adequate protection in terms of the antivirus? And the antivirus, is it updated? For instance, it can be a Symantec or a McAfee endpoint. So we have the capability to check if that update has happened. And if in case it is not meeting the requirement, the connection can be refused. So that is a good level of security level, isn't it? So you also need to know that hotfixes have to be applied there and hotfixes should be present. So all these are done. So device check and device binding are features which are great to have the device security for a user and connecting. As we know that a user today uses not just his or her laptop, but also uses multiple devices, BYOD, right? That is the scenario today. So that is the thing. Now, finally, so you may still be wondering about one more thing. I'm not sure, but I'll also try to put it in the FAQ. What about the database? What about the Active Directory or LDAP? Yes, so we support Microsoft Active Directory and Open LDAP for the authentication, and so that we can integrate that user to be part of that Active Directory authentication or LDAP authentication, and then get the connection completed. So we can also use the database present for the users within the controller, where we just use the built-in database, and if, in case you don't want to use the Active Directory, so that also can be done, no problem. So that with that, I come to the end of my presentation here on how the zero trust access works and how a secure connection is established for accessing resources very securely and making sure that we have access to only resources that a user is meant to access. Thank you so much. And I will.
Instasafe does touch upon all the necessities for a viable work from home security solution in terms of seamless user experience, easy deployment, being a flexible solution, a flexible cloud solution, in terms of security compliance, more security, 24/7 customer support, and troubleshooting. So, yeah, over to Shrikant again regarding the FAQ.
Yeah, so what I'll be doing is I'll be probably just sharing a couple of FAQs for you, which you can refer to and come back to us over email, which our marketing team will share.
Right.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your patience in listening to this and viewing this presentation.
Thank you to all the participants.